June 14, 2024, the day the submarine didn't sail. Let me tell you about the moment I knew we were sleepwalking into another geopolitical disaster. It wasn't the headlines, those came later, and they were predictable. Venezuela's submarine, a threat to regional stability, or US warns Maduro against military adventurism. No, it was the quiet, almost offhand remark from a Pentagon contact during a closed-door briefing in early June. When I asked about the status of Venezuela's aging Sabalo-class submarine, the response was a dry chuckle. One Venezuelan sub, zero chances. That was it. No alarm, no urgency, just the kind of dismissive confidence that has preceded every major American foreign policy blunder of the last 30 years. At first glance, the story seems straightforward. Venezuela, under Nicolas Maduro, has been flirting with military posturing for years, buying Russian arms, conducting joint exercises with Iran, and now, allegedly, attempting to revive its moribund submarine fleet. The Sabalo, a 1970s-era diesel-electric boat purchased from Spain in the 1980s, has been rusting in port for decades. According to U.S. Southern Command, Maduro's regime recently attempted to reactivate it, only for the vessel to suffer a catastrophic engine failure during sea trials. Case closed, right? A failed dictator playing with toys he can't afford, a regional nuisance, nothing more. But here's that narrative is a carefully constructed half-truth, and if we accept it at face value, we're missing the real story, the one that could drag the United States into another unwinnable conflict, this time on the doorstep of its own hemisphere. The official what they want you to believe. According to the Pentagon's public statements, Venezuela's submarine program is a non-issue. The Sabalo is a relic, incapable of posing a serious threat. U.S. intelligence assessments suggest that even if Maduro managed to get the sub operational, its range, speed, and armament are so outdated that it would be little more than a floating target. The State Department has framed the entire episode as a desperate attempt by a failing regime to project strength, while the media has largely echoed this line, treating it as a footnote in the broader saga of Venezuela's collapse. The numbers seem to support this. Venezuela's defense budget has shrunk by over 90% since 2013, thanks to economic mismanagement and U.S. sanctions. The country's navy is a shadow of its former self, with most of its ships either decommissioned or in disrepair. The Sabalo itself is a Daphne-class submarine, a design that first entered service in the 1960s. Its maximum speed is 13 knots submerged, its range is limited to 4,500 nautical miles, and its armament consists of a handful of aging torpedoes. By modern standards, it's a museum piece. The official line is that Maduro's submarine gambit is a last-ditch effort to distract from domestic crises, hyperinflation, mass emigration, and the slow strangulation of his regime by U.S. sanctions. The White House has even suggested that the whole thing is a Russian-Iranian disinformation operation, designed to provoke a U.S. overreaction and justify further military aid to Caracas. This is classic Maduro, a senior administration official told the New York Times. He's trying to make himself look relevant when he's anything but. But there's a problem with this narrative. It ignores the geopolitical chessboard. It assumes that Maduro is acting alone, rather than as a pawn in a much larger game. And most dangerously, it underestimates how quickly a seemingly minor incident can spiral into a full-blown crisis when great powers are involved. Deconstructing the what's really happening. Let's start with the submarine itself. Yes, the Sabalo is old. Yes, it's in poor condition. But here's what the Pentagon isn't telling: Venezuela didn't just try to reactivate it. They succeeded, at least partially. In late May, satellite imagery from Maxar Technologies captured the Sabalo conducting sea trials off the coast of Puerto Cabello. The sub was moving under its own power, albeit slowly, and was accompanied by a support vessel. This wasn't a one-off event. Over the past year, there have been multiple reports of Russian and Iranian technicians working at Venezuelan naval bases, including at the base Naval Agustin Armerio in Puerto Cabello, where the Sabalo is docked. These aren't just rumors. In March, the U.S. Treasury sanctioned a Russian defense contractor, JSC Rosoboronexport, for allegedly providing technical assistance to Venezuela's submarine program. Now, why would Russia and Iran invest time and resources in a submarine that, by all accounts, is obsolete? The answer lies in what the Sabalo, not a direct military threat, but a force multiplier in a broader asymmetric strategy. Venezuela's navy may be weak, but its coastline is long, its waters are rich in oil, and its ports are critical nodes in global energy trade. A single operational submarine, even an old one, could disrupt shipping lanes, harass U.S. naval patrols, or serve as a platform for covert operations. More importantly, it could be used as a tripwire. Imagine this: the Sabalo is detected near a U.S. carrier strike group in the Caribbean. The U.S. Navy, following standard rules of engagement, orders it to surface. The Venezuelan crew refuses. A warning shot is fired. The sub doesn't respond. At what point does this become an act of war? This is where the real danger lies. The Sabalo isn't a weapon of mass destruction. It's a provocation away for Maduro to test U.S. resolve, to force Washington into a position where it either backs down or escalates. And make no, Maduro isn't acting alone. He's getting help. Russia has been quietly rebuilding its influence in Latin America for years. In 2022, Moscow signed a military cooperation agreement with Venezuela, including provisions for joint naval exercises. Iran, too, has deepened its ties with Caracas, supplying drones, missiles, and, according to some reports, even helping to develop a domestic submarine program. The Sabalo may be a relic, but it's a relic with foreign advisors on board. Then there's the economic angle. Venezuela sits on the largest oil reserves in the world, and its offshore fields are increasingly attractive as global energy markets tighten. A submarine patrolling those waters isn't just a military asset, it's a tool for resource denial. If Maduro can credibly threaten to disrupt oil shipments, he gains leverage over both the U.S. and his regional rivals. So no, this isn't just about a rusty submarine. It's about spheres of influence, great power competition, and the slow unraveling of American hegemony in its own backyard. The broader geopolitical how we got here. To understand why a single Venezuelan submarine matters, you have to out. The world is in the midst of a fundamental shift, from a US-dominated unipolar order to a multipolar system where power is diffused among multiple centers. Russia, China, and even regional players like Iran are challenging American primacy, not by matching the US militarily, but by exploiting its weaknesses. Latin America has become a key battleground in this struggle. For decades, the US treated the region as its de facto sphere of influence, intervening at will to install or remove governments, control resources, and suppress leftist movements. But that era is ending. China has become the top trading partner for most South American countries. Russia has reasserted itself as a military and diplomatic player. And Iran, once a distant actor, is now a direct presence, with intelligence operatives, proxy groups, and even military advisors embedded in countries like Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Bolivia. The U.S. response has been a mix of denial and overreach. On one hand, Washington still acts as if Latin America is its backyard, demanding loyalty and compliance. On the other, it has failed to offer a compelling alternative to the economic and security partnerships being forged by its rivals. The result? A region that is increasingly hedging, taking aid from China, arms from Russia, and investment from Iran, all while avoiding direct confrontation with the U.S. Venezuela is the perfect example of this dynamic. Maduro's regime is a pariah in Washington, but it's a strategic partner in Moscow and Tehran. The submarine incident isn't an isolated event, it's a test case for how far the U.S. is willing to go to maintain its dominance. And the early signs aren't encouraging. Consider the historical parallels. In 1962, the U.S. discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, leading to the most dangerous standoff of the Cold War. The crisis was resolved through back-channel diplomacy, but it said the U.S. would not tolerate foreign military bases in its hemisphere. Fast forward to 2024. Russia isn't deploying nukes, but it is stationing military advisors, selling advanced weapons, and helping Venezuela rebuild its navy. Iran isn't building missile silos, but it is helping Caracas develop drone and submarine programs. The difference? Today, the U.S. is distracted by Ukraine, by Taiwan, by its own domestic divisions, and its adversaries are exploiting that weakness. This is the core of the problem. The U.S. still operates under the assumption that it can dictate the rules of the game in Latin America. But the game has changed. The question isn't whether Venezuela's submarine is a threat, it's whether the US can afford to ignore the broader challenge to its regional dominance. Military, why this could go very wrong. Now, let's talk about the military dimension. The US Navy is the most powerful in the world, and on paper, a single Venezuelan submarine shouldn't be a concern. But warfare isn't fought on paper. It's fought in the real world, where geography, politics, and human error play decisive roles. First, there's the issue of detection. The Sabalo is old, but it's also quiet. Diesel-electric submarines are notoriously difficult to track when submerged, especially in the shallow, cluttered waters of the Caribbean. The U.S. has P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft and Virginia-class attack submarines in the region, but those assets are stretched thin. The Navy is already struggling to counter Chinese action in the Pacific and Russian activity in the Arctic. Adding a Venezuelan submarine to the mix, even a weak one, complicates an already overburdened force. Then there's the rules of engagement. If the Sabalo is detected near a U.S. carrier group, what happens next? Does the U.S. fire a warning shot? Board the sub? Sink it? Each option carries risks. A warning shot could be ignored. Boarding a submarine is a high-risk operation, especially if the crew is armed. And sinking it? That's an act of war, one that could trigger a wider conflict. This is where the asymmetric nature of the threat becomes clear. Venezuela doesn't need a strong navy to cause problems. It just needs a credible one. A single submarine, even if it's ultimately destroyed, can force the U.S. to divert resources, alter deployments, and escalate tensions. And if the sub does manage to sink a ship? The political fallout would be catastrophic. I've studied these dynamics for decades, and I can tell you the U.S. military is not prepared for a sustained conflict in Latin America. The last time the U.S. fought a major naval campaign in the region was during the Cold War, and even then, it was against a vastly superior Soviet-backed Cuba. Today, the threats are more diffuse, the adversaries more unpredictable, and the political constraints more severe. The hawks in Washington will tell you that this is a quick and easy problem to solve. Just sink the sub, they'll say. Maduro is weak. He'll back down. But they're wrong. Every time the U.S. has assumed a conflict would be quick and easy, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, it has ended in disaster. Venezuela is no different. The country is a powder keg. The economy is in ruins. The military is divided. And the regime is desperate. A miscalculation, one wrong move, one overreaction, could ignite a crisis that spirals out of control. The domestic political why this is about more than Venezuela. Here's where it gets even more complicated. This isn't just about geopolitics. It's about politics, American politics. The Biden administration is in a tough spot. On one hand, it needs to project strength. The 2024 election is looming, and the GOP is already hammering the White House on foreign policy, accusing it of being weak on China, weak on Russia, and now, weak on Venezuela. Florida, a critical swing state, has a large Venezuelan exile community that despises Maduro. Any perceived softening on Caracas could cost Biden votes. On the other hand, the administration knows that a military confrontation with Venezuela would be a disaster. The U.S. public is war-weary. The Pentagon is focused on China. And the last thing the White House needs is another foreign policy crisis to manage. So what do? They split the difference. They issue stern warnings. They impose new sanctions. They conduct naval exercises in the Caribbean. But they stop short of direct action. This is the Biden doctrine in strategic ambiguity: enough pressure to look tough, but not enough to trigger a war. But here's the strategic ambiguity: only works if your adversaries believe you're willing to escalate. And right now, Maduro, Putin, and Khamenei don't. They see a U.S. that is distracted, divided, and desperate to avoid conflict. They see a president who is more concerned with domestic politics than grand strategy. And they're acting accordingly. This is the real danger. The U.S. is trying to bluff its way through a multipolar world, and its adversaries know it. They're calling that bluff, not with direct confrontation, but with salami tactics, small, incremental challenges that erode American influence without provoking a full-scale response. Venezuela's submarine is just one slice of that salami. Scenario how this could play out. So where does this go from here? Let's run through the possibilities. Scenario 1, the best case. In this scenario, the Sabalo remains a non-issue. The U.S. continues its current approach: sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and occasional naval exercises, while Maduro's regime collapses under its own weight. The submarine never becomes fully operational, and the whole episode fades into the background. The U.S. maintains its regional dominance, and Venezuela's crisis remains a humanitarian tragedy rather than a geopolitical flashbulb. This is the least bad outcome, but it's far from certain. For it to happen, Maduro would have to miscalculate even worse than he already has, and the U.S. would have to avoid any major escalation. Given the current trajectory, that's a long shot. Scenario 2, the most likely. Here, the Sabalo becomes a persistent irritant. It's not a major military threat, but it's enough to force the U.S. to divert resources. The Navy increases patrols in the Caribbean. The Coast Guard ramps up interdiction efforts. And the U.S. starts providing more military aid to Colombia, Guyana, and other regional allies. Meanwhile, Russia and Iran double down on their support for Maduro. They send more advisors, more weapons, and more economic lifelines. Venezuela becomes a proxy battleground, not a direct conflict, but a low-intensity struggle where the U.S. and its adversaries test each other's limits. This is the new normal in Latin, a region where the U.S. is still the dominant power, but where its influence is contested at every turn. It's not a war, but it's not peace either. It's managed instability, a slow bleed of American power, one submarine at a time. Scenario 3, the worst case. This is the scenario that keeps me up at night. In this version, the Sabalo isn't just a nuisance, it's a catalyst. Imagine the submarine is detected near a U.S. oil tanker in the Gulf of Venezuela. The Navy orders it to surface. It doesn't. A warning shot is fired. The sub still doesn't respond. The U.S. commander on the "Now what?" Maduro declares it an act of war. Russia and Iran condemn the U.S. and the UN. Protests erupt in Caracas. And suddenly, the U.S. is facing a regional crisis, one that could spiral into a broader conflict. This isn't far-fetched. It's exactly how the Gulf of Tonkin incident started. It's how the USS Liberty almost triggered a war with Israel. And it's how a single miscalculation can turn a minor incident into a global problem. The worst part? The U.S. wouldn't even know if it was a deliberate provocation or just a tragic accident. And by the time it figured it out, it would be too late. Grand the death of liberal hegemony. At its core, this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the failure of American grand strategy. For the last 30 years, the U.S. has operated under the assumption that it could reshape the world in its image, that democracy, free markets, and American military power could create a stable, unipolar order. This was the liberal hegemony project, and it has failed spectacularly. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, these weren't just military defeats. They were strategic defeats. They exposed the cracks in the very foundation of American power. The assumption was always that if the U.S. could just outspend its rivals, if it could maintain a military budget larger than the next 10 countries combined, then the system would hold. But what we're seeing now is that money can't buy influence when the rules of the game have changed. The Sabalo isn't just a submarine, it's a symbol of how cheap, asymmetric challenges can erode the most expensive military in history. Let me explain why this matters beyond Venezuela. The U.S. Navy, for all its carrier strike groups and nuclear submarines, is optimized for blue water dominance, controlling the open oceans, projecting power against peer competitors like China or Russia. But what happens when the threat isn't a fleet of destroyers but a single diesel-electric sub lurking in shallow coastal waters? What happens when the enemy isn't trying to defeat the U.S. in a conventional war but simply to outlast it, to make every operation just costly enough to force Washington to question whether it's worth the trouble? This is the lesson of the last 2 decades, and it's one the Pentagon still hasn't fully internalized. In Iraq, the US could crush Saddam's army in weeks, but it couldn't pacify Fallujah. In Afghanistan, it could topple the Taliban in months, but it couldn't secure the countryside. And now, in the Caribbean, it can track a Venezuelan submarine, but it can't stop it from slipping into the shadows. The problem isn't technology, it's strategy. The US keeps preparing for the last war, or worse, the war it wishes it could fight, while its adversaries are playing an entirely different game. Now, what most people don't realize is how this dynamic is already reshaping the Western Hemisphere. For decades, the US treated Latin America as its backyard, a region where it could intervene at will, prop up friendly dictators, and ignore the consequences. But that era is over. The rise of China as a major economic player in the region, lending more to Latin America than the World Bank and IMF combined since 2005, has given countries like Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua real alternatives. Russia's arms sales and Wagner Group deployments in places like Nicaragua and Haiti have created a low-cost way to bleed US influence. And Iran's growing ties with Venezuela, including the recent opening of a drone factory in the country, show how even distant powers can exploit American vulnerabilities. Here's the uncomfortable: the US is still the dominant power in Latin America, but it's no longer the only power. And that changes everything. When the Soviet Union tried to put missiles in Cuba in 1962, the US could impose a naval blockade and force a withdrawal because it had unchallenged regional hegemony. Today, if Russia or Iran tried something similar, say, deploying anti-ship missiles or drones to Venezuela, the US would face a much harder choice. Does it risk a direct confrontation with nuclear-armed powers over a country that, let's be honest, most Americans couldn't find on a map? Or does it accept that its sphere of influence is shrinking, one submarine at a time? This is the new reality of great power competition in the 21st century. It's not about who has the most tanks or the biggest aircraft carrier. It's about who can endure the most pain, who can turn local conflicts into global quagmires, and who can make the other side question whether the cost of dominance is worth the price. The Sabalo is just one piece of this puzzle, but it's a telling one. Because if the US can't handle a single Venezuelan submarine, what happens when China starts deploying its own subs to the region? What happens when Iran's proxies in the Caribbean start targeting US shipping lanes? What happens when the next crisis isn't in the Gulf of Venezuela but in the Taiwan Strait, and the US is already stretched thin dealing with a dozen smaller fires? This is the death of liberal hegemony by 1,000 cuts. Not a single catastrophic defeat, but a slow, grinding erosion of American power, one that plays out in the shadows, in the gray zones where the rules are unclear and the stakes are deliberately kept low. The US still has the most powerful military in the world, but power isn't just about what you can destroy. It's about what you can control. And right now, the US is losing control not because it's weak, but because the world has changed, and its strategy hasn't. So where does this leave us? The answer isn't more aircraft carriers or more sanctions. It's a fundamental rethinking of what American power is for. For too long, the US has assumed that its military dominance would translate into political influence. But in a world where every adversary has learned to fight asymmetrically, where every conflict is a proxy war, and where every crisis is a test of resolve, that assumption is no longer tenable. The Sabalo isn't just a submarine. It's a warning. And if the US doesn't start listening, the next warning might not be so subtle. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about submarines or even Venezuela as a standalone problem. It's about the slow-motion collapse of a political order that Washington has taken for granted for decades, and how Caracas, of all places, has become a perfect laboratory for what happens when that order starts to unravel. The Sabalo isn't just a military challenge, it's a symptom of a much deeper domestic dysfunction in both countries, one that neither government seems willing or able to fix. Let me explain why this matters for the US first. The Biden administration's approach to Venezuela has been a masterclass in strategic incoherence. On one hand, you have the State Department still clinging to the fiction that Nicolas Maduro is a temporary aberration, that sanctions and diplomatic pressure will eventually force him out. On the other, you have the Treasury Department quietly granting waivers to Chevron to keep pumping oil, because the alternative, letting Venezuelan crude disappear from global markets, would send gasoline prices soaring just as the president's approval ratings are sinking. This isn't strategy, it's damage control. And damage control isn't a sustainable foreign policy. The uncomfortable truth is that the US has no Venezuela policy, only a series of reactive measures designed to avoid short-term pain. The sanctions regime, which was supposed to cripple Maduro's government, has instead entrenched it. The 2019 oil embargo didn't topple the regime, it forced Caracas to pivot to Russia, China, and Iran for survival, creating a web of dependencies that now make Venezuela nearly untouchable. The Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign, which included recognizing Juan Guaidó as interim president, didn't spark a democratic uprising, it exposed the opposition as a fractured, leaderless movement with no real plan beyond hoping the US would do the heavy lifting. And now, with Guaidó's political capital exhausted and Maduro still in power, the US is left with a double down on a failed strategy or admit that regime change isn't coming. Here's the Maduro isn't going anywhere. Not because he's popular, he's not, but because he's mastered the art of survival in a collapsed state. The Venezuelan economy has shrunk by 75% since 2013, hyperinflation has rendered the bolivar worthless, and millions have fled the country. Yet Maduro's grip on power is stronger than ever. How? Because he's turned Venezuela into a criminal enterprise. The military, which controls everything from food distribution to gold mining, has no incentive to abandon him. The elite, who profit from smuggling and corruption, aren't about to risk their fortunes on a democratic transition. And the average Venezuelan, exhausted and impoverished, is too busy trying to survive to mount a revolution. This is the part that should keep US policymakers up at night. Venezuela isn't just a failed state, it's a failed state with a nuclear-armed patron, a rising superpower investor, and a regional ally that specializes in intelligence and repression. Maduro has learned from Saddam Hussein's he doesn't need WMDs to deter invasion. He just needs to make the cost of intervention so high that no one will risk it. The Sabalo is part of that calculus. So are the Russian Wagner Group mercenaries reportedly training Venezuelan forces. So are the Iranian drones being assembled in Venezuelan factories. Maduro isn't building a conventional military, he's building a deterrent. Now, let's talk about the domestic political dimensions in the US, because this is where the real paralysis sets in. Venezuela has become a partisan football in Washington, and neither side has an answer. For the left, the crisis is a cautionary tale about US interventionism, proof that sanctions and regime change policies only make things worse. For the right, it's evidence that the US has gone soft, that a stronger hand would have toppled Maduro years ago. Both sides are wrong, but neither has an incentive to admit it. The result? A policy that oscillates between half-hearted engagement and performative outrage, with no clear endgame. The 2024 election is only going to make this worse. If Trump wins, we'll likely see a return to the fire and fury approach, more sanctions, more threats, more bluster. If Biden wins, we'll get more of the cautious diplomacy, selective sanctions relief, and a refusal to acknowledge that the status quo is unsustainable. Neither candidate has a plan for Venezuela because neither wants to own the problem. And why would they? Venezuela is a losing issue. The American public doesn't care about it, the media only covers it when there's a migration crisis or an oil shock, and the political class has no appetite for another forever war. But here's the Venezuela isn't going to wait for US politics to sort itself out. The country is on a trajectory that could reshape the hemisphere, and not in a way that favors Washington. Let's run through the scenarios. First, the most likely Venezuela becomes a permanent narco-state, a kind of supersized version of what Honduras or Guatemala were in the 2000s. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration already estimates that 200 to 300 tons of cocaine transit through Venezuela annually, much of it controlled by the military and cartels with ties to Hezbollah and the Sinaloa cartel. If Maduro consolidates his control, Venezuela could become the primary hub for drug trafficking into the U.S., with all the attendant violence and corruption that implies. This isn't just a law enforcement problem, it's a national security threat. The last time the U.S. faced a narco-state of this scale was in Colombia in the 1990s, and it took a decade of Plan Colombia, a $10 billion aid package, to turn the tide. Venezuela is bigger, more strategically located, and far more integrated into the global criminal economy. The U.S. isn't prepared for that fight. Second, the nightmare Venezuela collapses into a full-blown civil war. This isn't as far-fetched as it sounds. The country's institutions are already hollowed out, the military is factionalized, and the opposition is too weak to govern but too strong to ignore. If Maduro dies or is incapacitated, the power struggle could turn violent. We've seen this movie before in Libya, in Syria, in Yemen, and the results are never pretty. A Venezuelan civil war would send millions more refugees into Colombia, Brazil, and the Caribbean, destabilizing an already fragile region. It would create a power vacuum that Russia, China, and Iran would rush to fill. And it would force the US to make an impossible intervene to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe or stay out and watch the hemisphere burn. Third, the Venezuela becomes a Chinese client state. Beijing has already invested billions in Venezuelan oil and infrastructure, and it's quietly exiting its military footprint in the region. If the US continues to push Venezuela away, China will be happy to step in. We're already seeing the early stages of this. In 2023, China and Venezuela signed a $4 billion agreement to modernize Venezuela's military, including the purchase of radar systems and drones. If this trend continues, Venezuela could become a forward operating base for Chinese power projection in the Western Hemisphere, a prospect that should terrify anyone who remembers the Cuban Missile Crisis. So where does this leave us? The US has three options, none of them good. Option: double down on regime change. This means tightening sanctions, increasing support for the opposition, and possibly even military action. The problem? It won't work. Maduro has survived worse, and the Venezuelan people are too exhausted to rise up. The US would be left with another failed intervention, another stain on its reputation, and another generation of anti-American sentiment in the region. Option: accept Maduro and try to manage the fallout. This means lifting sanctions, engaging with the regime, and hoping that economic incentives will moderate its behavior. The problem? It rewards bad actors and undermines US credibility. It also assumes that Maduro can be trusted, which he can't. The moment the US eases pressure, he'll pocket the concessions and keep doing what he's doing. Option: contain the damage. This means working with regional allies to isolate Venezuela, securing borders to prevent mass migration, and countering Russian and Chinese influence without direct confrontation. The problem? It's a defensive strategy, not a solution. It accepts that Venezuela is lost and focuses on limiting the spillover. It's the least bad option, but it's also an admission of defeat. Here's the uncomfortable: the US has already lost Venezuela. Not in a dramatic, Saigon-style collapse, but in the slow, grinding way that great powers lose influence, one miscalculation, one missed opportunity, one stubborn refusal to adapt at a time. The Cibalo is just the latest symptom of that decline. It's a reminder that in the 21st century, power isn't just about what you can destroy. It's about what you can endure. And right now, the US is enduring a lot. The question is whether anyone in Washington is paying attention. Because if they're not, the next crisis won't be a Venezuelan submarine. It'll be a Chinese base in the Caribbean, or a Russian nuclear submarine patrolling the Gulf of Mexico, or a migration wave so large it reshapes US politics. And by then, it'll be too late to do anything but react. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the broader unraveling of US hegemony in its own backyard, a process that began long before Maduro's submarine ever left port. The real question isn't whether the US can still project power in Latin America, but whether it can even define what power means anymore. Because right now, Washington is operating on a playbook written in the 1980s, when the Soviet Union was the only rival that mattered and the Monroe Doctrine still carried weight. That world is gone. The new one is messier, more diffuse, and far less forgiving of strategic laziness. Let me explain why this matters beyond Caracas. The Cibalo incident isn't just a Venezuelan provocation, it's a test. A test of US resolve, of NATO cohesion, of whether the West still has the stomach for the kind of asymmetric contests that define modern geopolitics. Russia and China are watching closely, not because they care about Venezuela's oil or Maduro's survival, but because they want to know if the US will flinch. And if it does, they'll push harder. We've already seen this play out in Syria, where Russian mercenaries and Iranian proxies probed US red lines until they found the soft spots. In Ukraine, where every Western hesitation was met with escalation. The pattern is the adversaries don't need to win outright. They just need to make the cost of resistance too high for the US to bear. Here's the uncomfortable: the US is still thinking in terms of binary choices, sanctions or engagement, intervention or isolation, when the reality demands something far more nuanced. The grand strategy for Latin America, if there is one, seems to be a mix of wishful thinking and inertia. The Biden administration's approach, for instance, has been to oscillate between half-hearted sanctions relief and performative tough talk, all while hoping that Maduro will somehow collapse under the weight of his own incompetence. That's not a strategy. That's a prayer. So what are the alternatives? Let's start with the one no one in Washington wants to: a long-term containment strategy that treats Venezuela not as a problem to be solved, but as a reality to be managed. This doesn't mean surrender. It means recognizing that the US can't fix Venezuela, but it can prevent Venezuela from breaking the region. That starts with 3 concrete steps. First, secure the borders, not just the US southern border, but the entire Caribbean basin. The migration crisis isn't just a humanitarian issue, it's a geopolitical weapon. Maduro has already used it as leverage, and he'll do it again. The US needs to work with Colombia, Brazil, and the Dominican Republic to create a regional migration framework, one that shares the burden and denies Venezuela the ability to export instability. This isn't about building walls. It's about building alliances. The 2016 Colombia peace deal, flawed as it was, showed that regional cooperation can work when the US provides the right incentives. We need a version of that for migration. Second, counter Russian and Chinese influence without falling into the trap of direct confrontation. Moscow and Beijing aren't in Venezuela out of altruism. They're there to bleed the US, to create a permanent distraction, to force Washington to divide its attention and resources. The US can't kick them out, but it can make their presence costly. That means targeted sanctions on Russian and Chinese entities operating in Venezuela, not just the regime itself. It means pressuring allies in Europe and Asia to stop buying Venezuelan oil, even if it's sold at a discount. And it means offering Latin American countries real alternatives to Chinese infrastructure loans, something the US has talked about for years but never fully delivered. The Build Back Better World initiative, announced with fanfare in 2021, has so far been little more than a press release. That needs to change. Third, and most controversially, the US needs to stop pretending that regime change is still on the table. It's not. The 2019 Lima Group fiasco, where Juan Guaidó was recognized as Venezuela's legitimate leader by over 50 countries only to be abandoned when the coup attempts failed, was a masterclass in how not to conduct foreign policy. The US burned its credibility on a gamble that never had a chance, and now it's paying the price. The alternative isn't to embrace Maduro, it's to accept that he's not going anywhere and adjust accordingly. That means back-channel diplomacy, not to reward the regime, but to prevent it from becoming even more dependent on Russia and China. It means offering limited sanctions relief in exchange for verifiable concessions, like the release of political prisoners or the reopening of opposition media outlets. And it means being honest with the Venezuelan: the US isn't coming to save them. Their future is in their own hands. Now, I can already hear the objections. But if we engage with Maduro, aren't we legitimizing him? Yes. But the alternative, continuing a failed policy that has done nothing but deepen Venezuela's crisis, is worse. Won't this embolden other dictators? Maybe. But the US has spent the last 2 decades emboldening dictators by either ignoring them or invading their countries. At some point, you have to ask which approach has been more effective. What about US credibility? Credibility isn't about never changing course. It's about being consistent in your objectives, even if your tactics evolve. The US lost credibility in Venezuela when it promised regime change and failed to deliver. It can regain some of that credibility by admitting that the old approach didn't work and trying something new. The deeper problem, though, is that the US still hasn't come to terms with what it means to be a declining hegemon. For decades, American power was so overwhelming that it could afford to make mistakes, failed coups, botched invasions, half-hearted sanctions, and still come out ahead. That era is over. Today, every misstep is exploited, every weakness is probed, every hesitation is interpreted as a sign of retreat. The Sabalo submarine is just the latest example. It's not a major military threat, but it's a symbol of how quickly the balance of power is shifting, and how little the US seems to understand that shift. Let me put this in historical context. In 1962, the US faced down the Soviet Union over missiles in Cuba.